Welcome to Lesson 5, and this lesson deals with functions. Now for me, I think functions are one of the most important features of any programming language. This is where all the processing takes place. This is where all the work gets done. So I call it the powerhouse or the workhorse of the language. Yes, I do understand that Swift is an object-oriented programming language, and classes and objects are quite important, but the backbone of any class or object is functions. And when we create classes and objects, these functions have a different name. They're called methods, but they still essentially do the same thing. So let's start off by creating some simple functions so we have a good background when we get into more complicated functions. So before I start writing some code or demoing some code to you, I would like to give you a conceptual view of functions. So think of a function as a block of code. Think of it as a block of code with a series of commands that's encapsulated in a single unit. Okay, and each function has a name. Let's say that this function has a name called sum. Okay. So we encapsulate lots of different statements or code into a block, and that function has a particular purpose and performs a specific task for us, and each function has a name. Now the beauty of functions is that it can be reused. You can call it many times. That's the beauty of functions. Now once the function is created, we need to call it. So the statement that calls the function is called the caller. And when we call the function, we normally pass what we call a parameter to it, or an input value. So the caller calls the function and passes a parameter to the function. The function accepts that input parameter, does some processing on it, and then returns a value to the caller. So you have the caller sending in an input, which is called the parameter, and the function does some processing and then returns an output back to the caller. Now you could have more than one parameter being passed as an input value to the function. Or if you don't want to have a parameter passed to the function as an input, you could pass no parameter to the function. That is referred to as void. You're sending no parameter to the function. Also, you don't necessarily have to return a value. You could return nothing, or you could return void back to the caller function. So as a recap, the caller can send parameters to the function, or it doesn't have to send a parameter to the function. It can send nothing or void. And when the function does its processing, it could output and return a value to the caller, or it doesn't have to. So in that case, it will return void or nothing. Now let's have a look at what are the different combinations of parameters and returns that we could have from a function. So let's put in a simple table. And let's call this one parameter, and let's call this return. So let's look at the different possibilities of how we could create functions. We could have an input parameter or more than one input parameter, and we could have a return, or we could have no input parameter or void and have the function return a value to us, or we could have an input parameter and get the function not to return a value to us or return void, or we could also have a function that does not have an input parameter and also does not return any values to us. So those are the four possibilities of creating when we create functions. So when we return now to the code, I'm going to show you four possibilities of how we can create simple functions. So let's look at this first function. Okay, now this function takes in a single input parameter and returns a value out. Okay. Every function needs to have a name, and the name of this function is called say hello. How do we know it's a function? We put in the keyword called func, F-U-N-C, and that tells the compiler that say hello is the name of the function. Then this function takes in one input parameter, and here in the function that input parameter is called person name and it's of type string. So what you see here between the brackets is the name of the input parameter and the type of the input parameter, and also this function is going to return a value, and that's what this dash and greater than sign, this arrow, means. It means it's going to return a string back to the caller. So we have the function, the name of the function, the input parameter and its type, and here what will be outputted, the type that's going to be outputted. So this function is going to take in a string. In this case it's going to be a person's name, and then it's going to output the person's name preceded by the word hello. So if the name of the person was John and we sent the string John to the say hello function, what will be outputted is a string that says hello John. Now let's look at the body of the function. Okay. What the body of the function does, it takes the string hello and combines it with the person name, which was the input to this function, and then combines it with an exclamation mark. So it concatenates the word hello with the input parameter that came in, the name of the person, and the exclamation marks, and creates a new string called greeting, a constant string called greeting. Once it's concatenated these three values, it then outputs that string as a return back to the caller, or the statement that calls it. So once you've defined your function, you then need to call the function, and that's what we are doing here. We're saying print line, we're calling the function using its specific name called say hello, and we are passing Anna to the function. So what happens here is Anna gets passed as an input parameter to the function, and the value of Anna gets stored in this variable called person name. So person name now contains Anna, which is a string. Person name then gets concatenated with hello and the exclamation mark and goes into a greeting. So greeting's got the big string, and then greeting is returned which is a string. The type of that greeting is string. So hello Anna will be returned back to the caller, and that's why you see hello Anna here at the output. Now the beauty of functions is that the code in the function can be reused as many times as you want to. So here I call the function again, but this time when I call the function, I'm passing Brian into this variable called person name. It gets concatenated into a greeting, and that greeting gets outputted as a return value back to the caller. So this was an example of a simple function that had one input parameter and returned a single value out. Let's have a look now at how we would write a function that has more than one input parameter. In this function is called addition. That's the name of the function, with a keyword func telling me that I'm defining a function. And I have two input parameters. The first input parameter is called num1. That's an integer, comma, and you separate your variables by using a comma. And it's also going to take another input parameter called num2, which is also an integer. It's going to do some processing on num1 and num2 and get the final answer, and then it's going to output the final answer, which is also an integer. So this is the type of the return value. This is the body of the function. It's going to take the value of num1 that was passed to the function. It's going to take the value of num2 that was passed to the function, and it's going to add it up and put it into a new variable called sum, and then return sum back to the caller. So let's check now, once we've defined the function, how do we call the function? I'm using a print line statement. I'm calling the function by its name, and I'm passing the value of 1 and 10 to the function. I'm passing two input parameters. This is how it works. The first value that you pass will go into the first variable called num1, and the second value that you pass will go into num2. So the order is quite important. It will then add num1 and num2, get the value of sum, and then return sum back to the caller statement. And in this case, it would be 11. So it will add up 1 plus 10 and give you the output of 11. Let's try different values in here. Let's try 100 and 200. So I'm passing 100 and 200 to the function. The function does the addition or summing and gives me the output of 300. So in this simple function, we take in more than one input parameter. In this case, it's two input parameters, and returns a value after the processing is done. Let's take another simple function. Now this function, if you don't want to pass any parameters to the function, you don't have to. You actually pass nothing or pass void. So that's what this function does. I have a function that's called say hello world, and I have no input parameters. I'm not going to pass any value to the function from the caller. That's why I've got the word void in here. It's going to not accept any input values, but it's going to output something. And the arrow means output. Output what? Output a string. And whenever you output something, you have to have a return command here. So it's just going to output the string hello world. So it takes in nothing, but it returns something. Let's call the function. So I'm typing a print line. I'm calling the function by its name, and notice I have not put anything in here because this function doesn't accept any input parameters. It accepts void, nothing. So therefore I do not pass any parameters to this function. Therefore I've got open bracket, close bracket in here. So nothing goes into the function, but the function is still called. I haven't passed anything. And it then outputs hello world and returns hello world to me. And that's why you see hello world being returned here. Now this word void tells the compiler that no input parameters are being passed to this function. If you do not want to type in the word void, you don't have to. You could just remove the word void to save you some time in typing. But the reason why I put the word void in was just for completeness sake, so that you know that no parameter was passed to this function. Let's take another example of a function. Now in this function we have an input parameter, but we have no return value. So this function is called say goodbye. It takes in one input parameter called person name, which is a string, and it outputs or returns nothing. It returns void. And in the body of the function, all it does is it prints the text goodbye and prints the person's name that was the input parameter to this function. Let's test it. So I call the function say goodbye. I pass in Dave as an input parameter, which is a string, to the function. So Dave goes into this variable called person name, and then person name is now used in this print line statement to print the text goodbye and the name of the person, and that's what gets outputted here. Goodbye Dave. Let's put in another name. Let's call it John. Okay, now you see it prints goodbye John. Let's look at the last possible combination. This function has no input parameters and no return value. It still does some processing, but it doesn't accept any input, and neither does it return anything back to the caller. So let's see how we define this function. This is the name of the function. It's called greeting. It does not accept any input parameters, so that's why we see a void, and it's returning void, returning nothing. So if it's not accepting anything and not returning anything, what is the purpose of this function? The purpose of this function, it prints hello world from within the function. It doesn't accept it from the outside, neither does it return it. It just prints from within the function. So here, once the function has been defined, I call the function, and notice I'm not sending any values to the function, so this is empty in here. So nothing goes into the function. It then prints hello world, and you see it here, and nothing gets returned to greeting. So that's why you don't see anything outputted here on the console, because nothing gets sent back to the caller. As I said to you in the previous example, whenever you're passing no parameter, you don't have to have the word void. You can remove the word void, and here, since we are not passing and not returning any value, we can remove that as well, and the program still works. But as we said, for completeness sake, if you're just starting off with programming, this will make more sense to you. So you can explicitly see there's no input parameter and there's no return type. Thank you so much for watching part A of this lesson 5. When we get back, we will deal more with more the complex or interesting applications of functions.